In the marble silence of ancient Sparta, power was measured not in gold or glory, but in control. Behind the legend of the noble king, Leonidas stood a queen whose name was whispered with both reverence and disgust, Gorgo of Sparta. History remembers her as a symbol of wisdom, but the truth buried beneath that image tells a darker story. A queen consumed by desire, intoxicated by power, and unashamed in her hunger to dominate the men who ruled an empire of warriors. What began as intellect turned to obsession, and what Sparta called virtue became its greatest sin. This is the forbidden truth of the woman who used lust to rule a kingdom and shamed the gods themselves. In the early years of her life, Gorgo was taught that Spartan women were not like others in Greece. While Athenian wives were kept behind veils and walls, Spartan women spoke freely, trained their bodies, and ruled their households. Gorgo's childhood was steeped in discipline, yet her spirit was restless. She learned that control, not beauty, defined a woman's worth. But in the shadows of her training, something else grew, a fascination with the way power could bend men. From the age of 13, she watched her father, King Cleomenes, manipulate the Spartan council with charm and cunning. She absorbed every lesson, every silence. And when men turned their gaze away, she learned to read what they feared, and how easily fear could be aroused. Gorgo understood early that a Spartan's strength was not unbreakable. It merely needed to be tempted. When she married Leonidas, her reputation was that of a loyal and intelligent wife. Yet beneath the quiet loyalty was a mind that found pleasure in control. In private, her words could disarm even the proudest warrior. Some chroniclers suggest that her marriage was not one of romance but of mutual calculation. Leonidas represented the heroic ideal, the unyielding soldier king, and Gorgo, the perfect Spartan woman. But as the years passed, the queen began to crave something deeper than companionship or admiration. She wanted influence. In the austere simplicity of Spartan life, desire was rarely spoken of, but always present. Physical strength, competition, and discipline created a tension that Gorgo learned to exploit. Her conversations with generals were slow, deliberate, and unnervingly intimate. She spoke not of affection, but of loyalty, of glory, of what they owed their queen. Ancient commentators noted that men left her presence, troubled in spirit, unable to sleep, their thoughts tangled between duty and temptation. Gorgo's allure was never the kind found in courtesans or slaves. It was born from intellect, from danger. She did not seduce, she studied. Each gesture, each breath, became a weapon sharpened by observation. By the time Leonidas took the throne, his wife had already become an invisible power within his court, shaping opinions through a glance, guiding decisions through suggestion. It was said that no man could meet her eyes without feeling both desire and dread. In Sparta, where emotion was weakness, that was her triumph. She made men feel. And in a city where control was sacred, Gorgo's mastery over emotion was an act of rebellion. As her influence grew, so did her hunger for the sensation of being obeyed. It was not pleasure in the body she sought, but the tremor of submission, that moment when a man's certainty faltered beneath her voice. Those who encountered her privately left changed, sometimes ashamed, yet drawn back again, unable to understand why. In the heart of the most disciplined society on earth, Queen Gorgo had discovered the forbidden truth, that desire was the purest form of domination. When Leonidas ascended to the Spartan throne, the world saw a union of virtue and valor. The king embodied the code of discipline, the queen, the voice of reason. Yet behind the public harmony, a slow corruption began to stir within Gorgo, a hunger not born of affection, but of possession. She no longer desired to merely advise men. She wanted to command them. And her chosen instrument was the oldest force known to humankind, desire itself. Gorgo's influence was subtle at first. In the dim courtyards of the palace, she lingered among the generals and councilmen, observing their pride, their hesitation, their unspoken need for approval. She learned that even the strongest Spartan warriors, hardened by pain and battle, carried the quiet longing to be seen, to be acknowledged. To these men, Gorgo offered not affection but understanding. Her voice softened where others barked orders. Her gaze lingered just long enough to unsettle their discipline. Ancient chroniclers wrote that she possessed a divine stillness, a calm so complete it drew men into confession. In her presence, words turned fragile. Men who would face death without fear stumbled beneath her questions. They mistook her curiosity for affection, her attention for intimacy, never realizing that she was studying them, measuring what could be broken. The queen's chambers became a place of whispered counsel. There were no witnesses, no promises, only the quiet rustle of fabric and the tremor of breath between command and surrender. No scrolls record what truly occurred there. Only fragments of rumor survived. Some said she sought no touch at all, that she derived pleasure from denial, from watching desire rise and wither under her calm restraint. Others claimed she used intimacy as currency, binding men to her will with unspoken oaths sealed in the dark. To the outside world, Gorgo remained the wise consort of a noble king. Yet within the palace walls, she had become something far more dangerous, a queen who ruled not through decree, but through the private weaknesses of those sworn to Sparta's law. Her charm turned into strategy, her warmth into weaponry. She understood that what men called virtue was often fear, fear of losing control, fear of exposure. And she fed that fear until it served her. One councilman, recorded in later Athenian gossip, confessed that he dreamed of her voice long after leaving the court, a whisper that returned in the night, urging loyalty, demanding obedience. He called her the spirit of command wrapped in a woman's form. To him, and to many others, Gorgo had become both muse and tormentor. Her husband sensed the change, though he could not name it. Leonidas was a man of war, built for clarity, but what Gorgo wielded was invisible. He saw her influence spread through the council, saw men hesitate before opposing her opinions. He mistook it for respect. It was not respect. It was captivity. In a land where soldiers were trained to suppress emotion, the queen had turned emotion itself into a weapon of war. She began to see her reflection not in the bronze mirrors of her chamber, but in the eyes of those who trembled before her. That was her pleasure, the silent acknowledgement that her will could shape even the most disciplined of men. By the time the first Persian scouts crossed the Aegean, Gorgo's power was complete. She was no longer the wife of Sparta's king. She was the hidden ruler of its hearts, a queen whose obsession had begun to consume the very soul of the city she claimed to protect. In Sparta, a man's worth was measured in silence and scars. Yet as whispers about Queen Gorgo spread through the barracks and temples, even silence began to fracture. Soldiers spoke of strange gatherings in the palace, of nights when torches burned long after the council had adjourned, and voices carried through the marble halls, low and fevered. The queen, they said, held secret rituals under the guise of prayer to Aphrodite, rituals that blurred the sacred and the profane. No written proof survives, only fragments, etched centuries later by those who claimed to descend from men who served her. They described ceremonies not of wild indulgence, but of submission, where power itself was stripped and offered to the queen like an offering to a goddess. Men of noble birth were made to kneel, to recite oaths of loyalty that touched the line between reverence and humiliation. Whether these accounts were truth or enemy invention, they revealed a deeper anxiety in Sparta, that the queen's influence had become something beyond mortal restraint. Leonidas, meanwhile, stood at the height of his legend. The world revered him as the embodiment of Spartan virtue, disciplined, just, incorruptible. But even kings cannot silence rumor. Each whisper of Gorgo's private ceremonies was a dagger to his pride. Her control over the court was undeniable. When he spoke, men listened out of duty. When she spoke, they obeyed from compulsion. Historians later described their union as one of contrast, the king of war and the queen of persuasion. But to those who served closest to them, it became clear that Gorgo's presence unsettled even the king. He could not confront her directly. Her intellect was too sharp, her calm too disarming. He had married a symbol of Spartan virtue, and yet, each time she moved through the palace, he felt that virtue mocked. Athenian chroniclers, always eager to soil Sparta's reputation, wrote that the queen turned her intelligence into spectacle, hosting closed gatherings for select commanders where she challenged their resolve with questions of loyalty, love, and fear. Some called these meetings tests of faith. Others saw them as deliberate humiliations meant to expose weakness. Men left pale, shaken, sometimes unable to meet her gaze again. The lines between philosophy and seduction blurred. Leonidas forbade these gatherings, yet they continued in secrecy. To oppose her would have meant open conflict within the royal house, a scandal Sparta could not afford as war with Persia loomed. So he endured it, watching as his queen's shadow grew across his throne. Each soldier's glance, each hesitant bow, reminded him that his authority was no longer absolute. Gorgo herself seemed untouched by the rumors. To her, shame was a tool, something to be mastered, not feared. In public, she was the model of composure. In private, she explored the edges of control, the point where reverence became surrender. What others called depravity, she called clarity, proof that even the most disciplined souls could be unmade by desire. For Leonidas, the greatest humiliation was not her defiance, but his fascination. He could not hate her, for part of him understood her power. She reflected the truth he denied, that in every warrior's heart lay a craving to submit to something stronger. As Sparta prepared for war, its king faced an enemy unseen, a queen whose quiet obsession had turned the city's strength into its greatest weakness. In her quest to master desire, Gorgo had conquered the one thing Sparta swore no one could control, its pride. When word spread that Leonidas would seek divine counsel before the Persian War, the people of Sparta prayed for clarity. But in the shadows of the temple of Apollo at Delphi, it was not the king's soul that trembled, it was the queen's. For Gorgo, prophecy was not faith. It was domination disguised as devotion. The journey to Delphi was long and steep, lined with the scent of burning myrrh and dust. Gorgo walked beside her husband in silence, her eyes fixed on the temple ahead, a place where mortals claimed to hear the voices of gods. Yet she did not come to listen. She came to see whether divinity itself could be bent to her will. Within the temple, the oracle's attendants prepared the ritual. The Pythia, the priestess said to speak for Apollo, sat upon her sacred tripod above the rising vapors of burning laurel. The air was heavy with incense, the light dimmed to gold and smoke. Gorgo watched as the priestess trembled, her voice low and strange, delivering riddles that shaped the fate of nations. It was then that Gorgo requested what no queen had ever asked, to remain after the prophecy. Leonidas hesitated but allowed it, believing her curiosity harmless. Yet what transpired within that chamber would haunt whispers for centuries. The oracle's attendants described her afterward as calm yet fevered, her eyes reflecting the flame as though it burned within her. She knelt before the altar of Aphrodite Inoplian, the warrior goddess of desire, and invoked a ritual forbidden to Spartan women. It was said this rite blurred the lines between flesh and spirit, between control and surrender. In its truest form, it was not an act of lust, but of invocation, a summoning of power through the surrender of restraint. Witnesses spoke of the strange rhythm of the ritual, slow, deliberate movements, hands raised, voice low as she chanted ancient phrases in a tongue no longer spoken. The priestesses claimed she sought communion with both Aphrodite and Ares, the lovers of myth, whose union symbolized the fusion of passion and war. For Gorgo, this was not worship. It was conquest, the testing of her will against that of the gods themselves. Her lips formed words of devotion, yet her mind demanded dominion. The scent of smoke and oil filled the air, and the priestesses said that when the ritual ended, her body trembled not with weakness but with control, the calm after an invisible storm. Later, when Leonidas re-entered the chamber, he found his wife in silence before the altar, her expression unreadable. To him, it appeared as reverence. To her, it was triumph. She had crossed the line between sacred and forbiddens, between the mortal and the divine. And in doing so, she had confirmed what she had long suspected, that even holiness could be corrupted by desire. When they returned to Sparta, the queen's demeanor changed. She spoke of destiny, of divine favor, of seeing visions in the smoke. But behind her words burned something deeper, an unspoken conviction that she had touched something greater than prophecy itself. Her attendants noted that her sleep grew restless, her eyes distant, her gestures slower, more deliberate. She had tasted a form of control that even the gods might envy. From that night at Delphi onward, Gorgo no longer sought influence through men. She began to believe she was chosen, not by Apollo nor by Leonidas, but by the hunger within her that the gods themselves had failed to master. And that belief, that divine lust for power, would soon drag Sparta into its darkest hour. When Leonidas marched toward Thermopylae with his chosen 300, Sparta watched in solemn pride. The queen stood at the city gates, veiled in crimson, her expression carved in calmness. Yet beneath her stillness lay something colder than grief, a quiet satisfaction. She had urged her husband to go, not as a wife surrendering a husband to war, but as a ruler sending forth her instrument of destiny. The people saw courage in her eyes. Those who knew her saw calculation. Gorgo understood what victory or death would bring. If Leonidas triumphed, his glory would crown her influence. If he perished, she would inherit his power. To her, the outcome mattered less than what it confirmed, that the gods, the city, and even fate itself obeyed her will. For days after the army's departure, she ruled from the council chambers, issuing commands with the same precision Leonidas wielded on the battlefield. Messengers from allied cities came to Sparta seeking instruction, and it was Gorgo's voice they met, calm, measured, unflinching. She spoke as though the king's words lived on through her, but those who listened felt something different, a force detached from grief, untouched by fear. When news of the Persian advance reached Sparta, the city braced for the inevitable. The queen's attendants claimed she slept soundly, her dreams unbroken. Only once did she speak in her sleep, whispering words that chilled even the most hardened servant. Now they will know which of us truly rules. The final dispatch arrived at dawn. The 300 were dead. Leonidas had fallen. The messenger's trembling voice filled the council hall, but Gorgo did not flinch. Instead, she rose from her seat, placed a hand over her chest, and said the words Sparta would never forget. So dies the body of our courage. But the will, that is mine. Her restraint was praised across Greece. The poets called her the widow of iron, the embodiment of Spartan discipline. But among the women of the court, her composure was whispered about with dread. They said she wore no mourning garb for weeks, that she spent her nights in the same chamber where she once advised generals, staring into the flame of the oil lamps as if awaiting an unseen guest. It was in those nights that Gorgo's transformation deepened. Her grief did not break her. It purified her obsession. Without Leonidas, there was no longer any need to disguise her authority behind his name. She began to summon the council alone, her voice low, deliberate, her gaze unyielding. Each order she gave was met with obedience, not because of law, but because no one dared defy her. Rumors spread that she performed private vigils to Aphrodite Enoplion, the same goddess she had invoked at Delphi. Witnesses described strange rites of solitude, long hours in silence, broken by murmurs of devotion and the sound of bronze striking stone. Whether acts of mourning or communion, no one knew. But the queen's eyes, once sharp and alive, now glowed with something otherworldly, the gaze of a woman who had crossed beyond sorrow into revelation. Sparta mourned its fallen king. Gorgo did not. She had discovered a new form of intimacy, not of flesh, but of power. The devotion of her people, the trembling of men in her presence, the silence that followed her commands, all of it fed the hunger she could no longer deny. In losing her husband, she had found her truest desire, to reign unchallenged over the living and the dead. After Thermopylae, Sparta crowned its widows with glory instead of grief. Yet no widow carried herself like Gorgo. Where others wept in silence, she summoned them. She called together the wives of generals, magistrates, and envoys and formed what the chronicles would later call the Women's Council, a circle that met at night beneath the colonnades of the royal courtyard. Outwardly, its purpose was noble, to instruct women in discipline, restraint, and civic virtue while their husbands waged war. But inside those marble halls, the air grew strange. Lamps burned low, the scent of oil and incense thickened, and the queen spoke not of duty but of transformation. The city of warriors, she told them, is now a city of widows. We must learn to rule the pulse that rules them. No records describe the precise nature of these meetings, only that they left the women changed. They returned to their homes calm and distant, their eyes bright with something unspoken. Servants whispered that the queen taught them gestures, rituals of posture and gazeways to command without words. Some said she made them rehearse oaths of secrecy that bound them tighter than marriage itself. As months passed, the gatherings deepened. The women began to test their influence over the men of the council. Subtle questions became strategic suggestions. Courtesies became commands. Gorgo's circle spread through the city like a hidden network. Even the austere elders of the Gerousia felt its reach, though none dared name it. The queen's philosophy was simple. Emotion, once mastered, was the strongest weapon in Sparta. Rumors reached Corinth and Athens that Sparta had turned decadent, that its women held midnight debates where the line between virtue and vanity blurred. But no outsider was ever allowed to witness them. One traveler recorded hearing rhythmic chanting from the palace courtyard, voices of women rising and falling like a tide. To him it sounded like prayer. To others, defiance. Gorgo's authority grew absolute. She selected which petitions reached the council, which alliances were honored, which households prospered. Her circle enforced her will with terrifying efficiency. Those who refused the queen's counsel found their families isolated, their reputations quietly undone. To the men who questioned her, she offered a single disarming phrase: "Sparta endures because its women do." None dared argue. Yet power carried a cost. The queen's closest attendants noticed her restlessness return. At night she wandered the colonnades alone, fingers tracing the cold marble, as though searching for something she had lost. Her teachings had given her control over others, but not over the hunger within herself, the need to feel absolute mastery, to bend not just bodies or politics, but fate. The secret court, as later historians called it, lasted less than 2 years, but its influence reshaped Sparta's order. Women began to inherit estates, manage warriors' training, and dictate terms to emissaries. To Gorgo, it was the perfection of discipline through desire control purified into a creed. When a Corinthian envoy dared call her circle a scandal, she answered with serene contempt, "If wisdom in women offends men, then let ignorance destroy them." What had begun as counsel had become quiet domination. And through it all, the queen stood untouched, convinced that she alone had discovered the final truth of Sparta's soul, that obedience, once born of fear, could be reborn as devotion. For years, Sparta's generals had revered Gorgo as the guardian of Leonidas's memory, the living embodiment of discipline and restraint. Yet as her influence deepened, admiration turned to suspicion. Chief among her loyalists was General Pleistarchus, a man bound to her not only by loyalty, but by fascination. His victories on the battlefield had been forged under her counsel, and his defeats, she reminded him, were lessons in obedience. At first, his devotion seemed harmless. He deferred to her in matters of strategy, defended her before the council, even adopted her austere maxims about emotional mastery. But beneath his reverence lay resentment. He began to feel that his triumphs were not his own, that the queen's shadow lengthened over every honor he earned. What began as respect curdled into envy, and envy, in Sparta, was more lethal than fear. The breaking point came when Gorgo's circle of women began advising on military logistics, deciding supply routes, rationing iron, and rewarding troops. To the Gerousia, it was an outrage. To Pleistarchus, it was humiliation. He confided to a fellow officer that Sparta's armor now smells of oil and perfume. His words spread quickly, and with them, the first fracture in the queen's reign. Gorgo sensed the shift. During council debates, she watched him with the calm of a predator studying a wounded stag. When he refused to implement her latest reforms, she summoned him privately. What transpired between them remains the subject of speculation, but chroniclers agree that the meeting ended with silence and fear. The general left pale and shaken, while the queen appeared before the court serene, her hands folded, her eyes cold. Days later, secret letters bearing her seal were intercepted near the northern border, messages to Spartan allies, warning of a possible coup. The handwriting, the elders claimed, matched Gorgo's. She denied nothing, only asked to confront her accuser directly. When Pleistarchus stood before her, trembling, she addressed him with terrible calm. "You confuse the city's survival with your pride. One will live, the other will die." The council judged the case in whispers. Some argued for clemency, others demanded exile. But by dawn, the general was gone, vanished without trial or grave. His armor was later found hanging in the sanctuary of Artemis Orthia, a warning older than law itself. In its place, the queen erected a small marble tablet inscribed with a single phrase, "Obedience restores order." Historians would later debate whether she ordered his death or merely allowed it. What mattered was the effect. Fear tightened its grip on the city. Her circle grew quieter but more devoted. No one spoke the general's name again. To the outside world, Sparta appeared unchanged, disciplined, austere, unbreakable. But within its walls, a chill settled. The men whispered that their queen no longer ruled by counsel, but by design, shaping fate as she once shaped hearts. Gorgo stood on the palace terrace one evening, watching the soldiers drill below. Their rhythm was flawless, their obedience complete. Yet behind her calm eyes flickered something hollow, as though the victory had cost her the very thing she sought to master. Power had consumed passion. Control had devoured faith. And from that moment, every act of loyalty in Sparta carried the faint scent of betrayal. In the years that followed the general's disappearance, Sparta seemed more disciplined than ever. The streets were silent, the council obedient, and the women of Gorgo's circle spoke in the measured tones of those who no longer questioned. Yet beneath that stillness lay rot. What began as devotion to the queen's order turned into submission by fear. The air in the palace thickened with suspicion, an obedience so absolute that it became dangerous. It started with a whisper. A servant was accused of overhearing forbidden conversations among the queen's attendants. No one knew who denounced him, but by dawn he had vanished. Soon after, a magistrate who once praised her reforms was found dead near the Eurotas, his body untouched but his tongue removed. Officially, it was ruled a wolf attack. Unofficially, it was the beginning of the purge. Gorgo watched as her realm contracted around her. The very discipline she had cultivated now demanded constant purification. Her circle, once filled with fervent believers, began turning on itself, each woman eager to prove loyalty by naming another as unworthy. What had started as unity became ritualized fear. The queen neither stopped nor encouraged it. She merely observed, as though testing how far human obedience could stretch before it snapped. By now, her nights were sleepless. Witnesses spoke of lights burning in her chambers until dawn, the queen pacing, whispering fragments of her husband's name. To her, Leonidas had died a hero, yet his death had left her surrounded by weak men who obeyed out of terror, not conviction. She began to suspect that true purity required cleansing even the faithful. The first open act of the purge came during the festival of Hyacinthus. The queen ordered the women of her circle to swear a renewed oath of obedience before the statue of Artemis. Each was to place her hand upon the altar and repeat, "I am the vessel of Sparta's will." But when one woman hesitated, trembling under the queen's gaze, the ritual turned deadly. Gorgo declared hesitation a sign of deceit. The woman was seized and taken away. She was never seen again. From that night, every oath became an act of survival. Neighbors informed on neighbors. Husbands reported wives. A chill gripped the city as if an unseen plague had spread, one born not of disease, but of the queen's ideology. She no longer ruled through counsel or philosophy. She ruled through dread. And yet, in her mind, it was righteousness. She wrote in her surviving letters that Sparta's virtue decays in the silence of doubt. Only through terror does obedience become sacred. It was her final evolution. A woman who had once equated discipline with love now saw it as the only path to redemption. When her advisors begged her to stop the executions, she dismissed them coldly. "Fear is proof of faith," she said. "Those who tremble are still mine." By the end of that year, 31 citizens, nobles, elders, even former allies had disappeared. The city that once marched with unity now moved like a body whose limbs feared its own heart. The queen's power had become a reflection of her own unraveling mind. In the chronicles that survived, one sentence captures the horror of her reign. Under Queen Gorgo, obedience itself became the crime. And so, the purge of the obedient became the darkest paradox of Spartan history, where loyalty, once the highest virtue, was devoured by the very hand that demanded it. By the time the purge had consumed the last of her rivals, Gorgo ruled alone. The city obeyed without question, but in her palace, silence reigned, not the silence of order, but of exhaustion. Servants moved like shadows, careful not to draw her gaze. Yet amid the fear, one voice refused submission: her daughter, Demetria. Little is recorded of her, but ancient historians describe her as the reflection of Gorgo's youth, bright, proud, and unbroken. While the queen sought to perfect obedience, her daughter despised it. Demetria believed that Sparta's soul was dying, strangled by her mother's doctrine. In secret, she began to gather those who still remembered the old virtues of courage and freedom. The confrontation came not in the council, but in the queen's private chambers. Chroniclers recount a single night when raised voices echoed through the palace, a mother and daughter divided not by love, but by the meaning of loyalty. Gorgo accused her of betrayal. Demetria accused her of madness. What followed remains uncertain, but witnesses claimed the queen's cries were heard long after the girls had ceased. The next morning, the princess was gone. Some said she fled to Corinth. Others whispered that she took her own life rather than become a pawn in her mother's reign. But among the servants, a darker rumor spread that Gorgo herself had ordered her disappearance, declaring that Sparta needs no heirs, only believers. Whatever the truth, something within the queen broke that day. Her letters grew erratic, filled with rambling thoughts about purity, legacy, and divine punishment. She began to see omens in every corner of the palace: blood on the marble, voices in the wind, shadows that spoke in her daughter's tone. The woman who once ruled with unshakable clarity now wandered her halls muttering prayers to gods long forgotten. The city noticed her decline. Her decrees became contradictory, executing one day, pardoning the next. Some said the queen no longer recognized her own attendants. Others claimed she had begun performing strange rituals at night, begging Artemis to return the child she had lost. Then came the plague. A fever swept through Sparta, taking soldiers and slaves alike. To many, it was divine punishment. When the queen's personal guard succumbed, the people whispered that her daughter's spirit had cursed the city. The blood of the innocent, they said, has called the gods against her. In a desperate act, Gorgo ordered the temples purified and the sick removed from the city walls. But it was too late. Her authority shattered as priests refused her commands. The same citizens who once trembled before her name now crossed themselves when they spoke it. In her final public appearance, she addressed the council with trembling hands. "You think the gods punish me," she said, her voice thin and cold. "But they punish you for forgetting who made you obedient." That night, the palace torches burned until dawn. When the guards entered her chambers the next morning, they found only her crown resting upon the altar and the faint scent of burned oil in the air. Some claimed she fled into the hills. Others believed she took her own life, haunted by the curse of her daughter's defiance. But in the years that followed, Spartans told one chilling tale, that on certain nights, a woman's voice could still be heard among the ruins, whispering to a child who no longer answered. Years passed, and Sparta changed. The wars continued, the kings came and went, and the city once ruled by Gorgo became a shadow of itself. Her laws were quietly revoked, her circle disbanded, her writings burned. Only fragments survived, broken tablets, half-legible lines carved in stone. The chronicles that mentioned her name did so with caution, as if invoking the curse. Archaeologists centuries later would search for her burial place, but none could find it. The tombs of kings lined the valley, their inscriptions proud and clear. Yet where the queen should have rested, there was nothing, no marker, no offerings, only an uncut slab of marble stained by time. Some said her remains were cast into the river to cleanse Sparta of her shadow. Others whispered that her body had never been found because her soul had refused the peace of death. Among the ruins of the ancient palace, one chamber remained sealed for generations. When it was finally opened, explorers found a single iron crown resting atop a stone basin, surrounded by the faint traces of burned olive oil. On the wall, almost invisible beneath centuries of soot, were the words, "Discipline is eternity." To the historians of later ages, it became the symbol of her reign, a woman who sought to perfect control until it consumed her completely. Her story was erased not by enemies, but by silence. The same city that once obeyed her every command had chosen to forget her. That was Sparta's final judgment. And yet, traces of her influence endured in subtle ways. The later reforms that granted Spartan women property rights and political voice bore resemblance to her decrees. Even her twisted ideology of strength through obedience found echoes in later rulers, who claimed to defend virtue while practicing tyranny. History, it seemed, had learned nothing. Local folklore transformed her into a phantom, a restless spirit who wandered the hills at dusk, searching for the daughter she destroyed. Travelers spoke of hearing faint footsteps in the ruins, or of seeing a flicker of light beneath the temple columns long after sunset. To them, it was not a ghost story, but a warning that even queens who rule by fear cannot escape it in the end. In the Chronicles of Plutarch, her name appears only once, followed by an ellipsis, as if even the ancient historian feared to finish the sentence. Scholars still debate whether it was censorship or superstition. But perhaps it was something deeper, the recognition that certain truths in history are too heavy to preserve, too horrifying to record. Thus ended the reign of Gorgo of Sparta, once celebrated as the paragon of virtue, later remembered as the architect of silence. Her tomb, if it exists, lies hidden beneath the earth she once commanded, forgotten by the people who once trembled at her name. And in that forgetting lies her final punishment, not death, nor disgrace, but erasure, the eternal void reserved for those who tried to master the human soul and were devoured by it instead. Centuries after her death, when historians spoke of Sparta's fall, they no longer mentioned Gorgo's name openly. Yet her ghost lingered in every account of the city's decline. To outsiders, she was a myth. To Spartans, a wound that never healed. The woman who once embodied discipline and virtue had become the symbol of their corruption, the queen who shamed the very ideal she swore to defend. Her story began in reverence. As the daughter of Cleomenes and wife of Leonidas, she had been the perfect image of Spartan womanhood, wise, restrained, unyielding. But the same city that forged warriors from childhood also forged her. When Leonidas fell at Thermopylae, the discipline that had once been her strength hardened into obsession. She did not break the Spartan code. She expanded it, distorting it until loyalty became servitude and purity became fear. Under her rule, the boundaries of power blurred. She redefined obedience as a virtue greater than courage and turned silence into the highest form of devotion. Sparta followed her willingly, believing they were preserving their order. But in truth, she was teaching them submission, not to the laws of Lycurgus, but to herself. Even after her disappearance, her influence endured like a curse. Later generations would speak of her reforms only in whispers, afraid to admit how much of her remained in their traditions. The rigid control, the ritualized discipline, the absence of mercy, all were her inheritance. She had taught Sparta to mistake obedience for strength, and it never recovered. Some philosophers tried to defend her legacy, calling her a tragic visionary, a woman who saw the world through the lens of duty and was destroyed by it. But the common people remembered her differently. To them, she was the mother who devoured her own child, the queen who demanded perfection and destroyed all who failed to meet it. In the centuries that followed, poets wrote of her not as a villain, but as a warning. They said her spirit walked the battlements on winter nights, whispering the word order to those who could not sleep. Priests claimed that crops failed whenever her name was spoken aloud. Even her image was erased from temple carvings, her likeness defaced until no trace remained. In a culture that worshipped memory, she was condemned to oblivion. And yet, her story survived not in marble or scripture, but in the unease that accompanied every tale of Spartan pride. Historians who studied her reign spoke of an empire that lost its soul in the pursuit of perfection, a society that turned virtue into tyranny. Her life became the dark mirror of Sparta's greatness, proof that discipline without compassion leads only to ruin. Today, among the ruins of ancient Laconia, there is no statue to her name. Only fragments of burned clay and half-vanished inscriptions remain, testifying to a queen who once ruled with absolute conviction and paid the price for believing she could command the human spirit as she commanded an army. Gorgo of Sparta, once hailed as the noble queen of warriors, became, in the end, the embodiment of the city's deepest shame. Her legacy stands not as a monument, but as a warning carved in silence, that the pursuit of purity can become the most corrupting desire of all.